All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Hermit Radio, and today I have Robert Talisse, professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University and author of two really great books. One of them I have right here called Overdoing Democracy, and then I believe your newest one is Sustaining Democracy, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Okay. Robert, do me a favor. Would you kind of just introduce yourself and talk about your credentials so that sets us up for the conversation?
Sure. So as Cameron, you were just saying, my name is Robert Talisse. I'm the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. That means I'm a philosophy professor. But my research specialization, the thing that I think about and write books about and give lectures about and teach, is the area of philosophy known as political philosophy. Political philosophy is the area of philosophy that investigates questions about whether there should be a state, if there should be a state, what the state should be doing, what it's permitted to do, what we owe to one another as citizens rather than merely just as moral persons, how the benefits and burdens of social cooperation ought to be distributed, as well as questions about, the nature of justice, freedom or liberty, autonomy, and correspondingly, the nature of injustice and tyranny and oppression. So those are the questions that that my field deals with. And many of them are also the questions that I myself, as a person working within the field of political philosophy, spend my time thinking about.
That's awesome. And that's perfect. I feel like that is absolutely perfect for our conversation today. And, we talked a little bit before we started recording, and, what I said was that I really wanted to talk to you because I would consider you an expert. Right. And that's why I like having these conversations, because I talk to a lot of people in my day to day, before COVID and before the 2020 election. I really did not involve myself in politics whatsoever. I was in the military, and that was about as far as my political, sphere went. I find politics boring. I find politics kind of toxic. But what has happened is that because of things like the 2020 election, I have found that there are a lot of people who talk about things and have zero clue what they're saying. They read some article from someone, whether even if it's from an accredited news source like CNN or New York Times or something like that. They're reading an article and thinking that somehow makes them an expert in the subject, but not realizing that articles like that are sometimes opinion based and not necessarily like a professional expert like yourself talking about this. So I guess the first question I want to ask is, why do you think, and I guess this might sound pretty simple to you, but why do you think we are so polarized right now?
Well, I think it's a good question. And I think that the way to begin to unlock it is to think a little bit about different things that we might mean when we're talking about polarization. I think that this word gets used a lot.
Yes.
From the president all the way down to people on the street. I don't think it's often defined. I don't think that people, when they use the word polarization, stop to wonder even what the term might mean. So I think that the first thing to do is to sort of separate out two different things, two different broad phenomena that we might be referring to when we're talking about polarization. And we'll give them two different names just to keep them distinct. So let's call political polarization the ideological distance or the doctrinal distance between the two major parties in the country. So we can say that political polarization is pronounced when the two major parties in the country, Republican Party and the Democratic Party, share no common ground legislatively, or from the point of view of their political agendas. So there's no overlap among the parties, which means that the middle ground between them falls away because nobody's occupying it, which also means that the party leaders and the candidates and the office holders assume an adversarial stance towards anybody on the other side,
Yes.
almost independently of what those others might think about substantive political issues, right? Almost independently of where the other side stands on immigration or criminal justice reform or environmentalism, that when the political parties are polarized in this sense that I've called political polarization, all of the policy stuff takes a backseat to cross-partisan animosity, where the candidates and the parties and the office holders have a lot to gain politically by expressing their distrust, disgust, dislike for those on the other side. And so politics, democratic politics, under conditions of severe political polarization, becomes toxic in the way that I think you were just pointing to. It's a lot of insults driven by each side casting the other as, you know, some kind of threat that needs to be neutralized. Let's not forget the 2020 presidential election. The two campaigns had nearly identical campaign slogans.
Right. Right.
One was saving America. The other one was fighting a battle for the soul of America.
Yeah. Right.
You say,
right.
well, wait a minute. Like,
yeah.
So politics becomes wrapped up then with symbolism and animosities and resentments, a lot of which is, you know, front and center, and then behind the scenes is where some sort of, you know, policy stuff is getting done or thought about. You say, well, wait a minute, in a democratic society, the policy stuff is supposed to be a little bit, you know, more central to what we're thinking about. So that's political polarization, and that's bad. And it's frustrating, and it makes for a lot of deadlock and paralysis in government. We're seeing some of that right now with the Build Back Better legislation. But I want to set that aside because I don't think that political polarization is necessarily bad for a democracy. Okay. You know, maybe it's bad for a democracy when it becomes elevated to a certain degree, or when it becomes particularly intense. But, you know, democratic societies are premised on the idea that, you know, free and equal citizens in good standing are going to disagree about politics, right?
Right.
I mean,
yes.
Democracy is about disagreement. And so the idea that there will be these conditions where the two major parties are going to pull apart to such an extent that it's not clear whether there's a common ground where they can negotiate or compromise. That seems to me to be part of the package of the possibility of that seems to me to be part of the package of democracy. And in fact, you might even say, well, you know, to a certain extent, political polarization might even be healthy for a democracy, because the citizens need clear ways to understand the differences between the political parties. And so a lot of the symbolism and the animosity and the hostility is really a way of keeping in the popular mind the distinction between the two parties. So, right. You know, we can argue about that. I happen to think that political polarization in and of itself might not be so terrible. What I think makes political polarization a problem is this polarization in this other sense. So that's political polarization. Here's the second sense of polarization. This is where I think all the trouble emerges. We can call it belief polarization. Sometimes researchers call this group polarization. I think the term group is misleading though. So I'm going to call it belief polarization. This belief polarization is not the metric or of the ideological distance between opposed parties. Belief polarization is a social cognitive phenomenon that occurs within like-minded groups, such as parties. Belief polarization is the phenomenon. It's very robust. It's been studied for, over 70 years, found all over the world, doesn't seem to vary in any of the ways that you think it might, according to education or religious conviction or, economic status or gender or identification, anything like that. Belief polarization is the yes man phenomenon. The more we surround ourselves with like-minded others, the more extreme we become.
The echo chamber.
Yeah, good. Exactly. The echo chamber stuff, the filter bubble stuff is typically just one instantiation of this broader phenomenon. So you surround yourself with people who all think like you. Well, eventually you and all of your friends start thinking more radical versions of your thoughts. Those more radical versions also are held with greater confidence. So you become more confident in the more extreme versions of your commitments. As you become more confident, you also become more prepared to engage in risky behavior on behalf of those more confidently held, more extreme views. All the while, you become more invested in policing the border between your like-minded allies and the people who you perceive to be different. And so, as groups belief polarize, as they become more extreme in these various ways, they also become more interested in policing or in imposing a likeness or conformity within. That is, they become more invested in being alike as a way of just making it really clear to figure out who your friends and who your foes are, right? It's not unlike showing up for a football game on Sunday with the team's colors on. You want the other fans to know you're a fan too, right? Well, similarly, in political groupings, as we belief polarize, we become more interested in making sure that our allies can clearly recognize us as allies, and we need to recognize them as allies. All the while, our negative attitudes and dispositions and feelings towards people who are members of the outgroup intensify. So people who are unlike us begin to look increasingly irrational, uninformed, bigoted, untrustworthy, unpatriotic, lazy, stupid. We become more inclined in experimental settings to interrupt them when they speak. We become less able to even give factual reports of the things that they say, right? So, what did this person who you see as a political foe say about, about the weather in San Antonio? You're like, well, we become less able to even report things they say that aren't really about politics, even because we're less able to hear them. So belief polarization is this cognitive phenomenon by which we become these more extreme, more insular, more conformist versions of ourselves. Now, here's where I think the real political problem is with polarization. And then I'll ask, then I'll answer the question, which is, how did we get so polarized? I think that the real problem of polarization is not the pulling apart of the two parties as such. It's the pulling apart of the two parties because the citizenry is so in the grip of belief polarization. That is, let me put it a slightly different way around. It's really good news for political candidates and their campaign managers, for the American public to be deeply belief polarized.
Yes.
It's really good for them. It makes all of the strategic choices about how to wage a winning campaign really easy. Um, because of the homogeneity part about belief polarization. Our more extreme selves are also more conformist. That means as groups belief polarize, not only do they come to believe more and more alike things in the direction of more extreme things, they also come to dress alike. They use words in similar ways. You know, in the United States today, you're probably aware of this. If you listen to how a candidate pronounces pronounces certain words, you can usually discern their ideological or their party affiliation, right? So the name of the country that is spelled IRAN and the country that's spelled IRAQ, if you just listen to a politician pronounce the names of those countries, that's a really reliable signal as to their party affiliation. They say Iran or they say Iran. And I don't even have to tell you, Cameron, I don't think, which party pronounces which pronounces it which way. So as groups become more extreme because of belief polarization, they become more conformist, and therefore they become more alike around a expanding range of behaviors. This is why, you know, we have these in the country now, we have these almost, you know, they're kind of funny, right? You know, who wears yoga pants?
Yeah, you're right. I mean,
who's wearing camo?
Right. Yeah.
Who drives an F-150?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And so what we see in the country now, good. All right, there you go. That's the
what's funny is I read the sleeve on the inside, and I'm just going to read this for my audience. Right, this is the inside of your sleeve, but I read this and I was like, oh god, this is so good. Let me get to that part where you're talking about this. Okay, here we go. When it is making matters worse, we are being appealed to by companies, products, and teams, for example, based on our deep-seated polarized beliefs, our choices of Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts, Costco or Sam's Club, soccer or football. And I think that goes to everything that you're saying, because even though those things are not, you know, not quite as harmful or stigmatizing as like what your take on you know, Israel and Palestine is, or should we attack Iran or should we not? Should we allow them to have nuclear weapons or should we not? Right. But it's the same thing. The same thing that makes us say Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts is the same thing that says attack Iran or leave Iran alone. Right.
This is exactly right. And so once you start seeing that, the entirety of social space, or maybe not the entirety, but increasing portions of social space where we spend our day-to-day lives are segregated according to partisan affiliation. So just to give other examples, so, you know, Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks is obvious, right? You don't even have to sort of do too much of the empirical stuff to see, oh yeah, the chances of running into a conservative voter at a Starbucks are really low. The chances of a liberal buying coffee at Dunkin' Donuts outside of Massachusetts, where the company started, is also really low. You're like, well, what's Dunkin' Donuts? What has been Dunkin' Donuts' marketing slogan for the past 20 years? America runs on Dunkin'.
Right.
They're not, you know, unlike Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts is not selling you the fantasy of being a cosmopolitan globetrotter, right? Contrast that with Starbucks, right? To order a drink at Starbucks, you have to pretend to speak a foreign language, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Good. The interior of Starbucks is filled with images of faraway places where the coffee is coming from, you know, Tanzania, you know, this sort of thing. And so Starbucks is clear. And by the way, there are comfy seats in a Starbucks. Dunkin' Donuts is selling coffee to people who are coming from work, going to work, picking up the kids, going to the next thing. It's about delivering caffeine and carbohydrates.
Right.
Starbucks is about this, you know,
experience,
European cafe experience, this simulation of the cafe culture throughout Europe. And again, you could say, well, okay, you know, citizens who vote for liberal candidates are significantly more likely to have a passport in the United States. for
Hmm.
example, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, I see, wait a minute. So right down to where we get coffee is sort of plugged into these broader sociological demographic differences that are tethered to partisan differences. Same goes, by the way, for occupations. And by the way, a lot of this stuff is new. Like this is stuff that's happened in the past 30 or 40 years, where occupations are now heavily sorted according to partisan affiliation, such that your surgeon is very likely to be conservative, your dentist is very likely to be liberal, for example, right? Because your audience can probably tell I'm not originally from Tennessee, but I'm originally from New Jersey. But it's very easy in Nashville, where there are lots of churches.
Yes.
Very easy by just looking at churches, what their political affiliations are, because they want you to know what the political affiliation of the church is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's
Good.
like one thing I could add to that, one
Yeah.
caveat I could add to that, right? If people need an example of that, and I'm not trying to be controversial by saying this. I'm just saying it in because it is a fact. Sure, you said we brought up the point of churches, right? Look what churches in Tennessee require you to wear a mask and which ones don't.
Yeah.
Right. I think that one thing right there could tell you without having to ask where do you align politically. I think that could give you an indicator, right?
That's exactly it. So, and by the way, those are manifestations of, other broader, sometimes deeper partisan differences about, trust in science. So the point I'm making is that belief polarization leads to what I call in the Overdoing Democracy book, political saturation, where political affiliations, partisan identities come to seep into and saturate the whole of social life, such that the chance of an unplanned encounter with a political opponent dwindles down to almost nothing. In this, here's, people don't believe me when I say this, but trust me, this is what the data bear out. Negative attitudes toward interpartisan marriages outstrip disapproving attitudes towards interfaith and interracial marriage in the United States.
I mean, it makes sense, but that is interesting.
You're like, whoa. So what we've seen in the past, again, maybe 40 years, 50 years, is that partisan affiliation through cognitive forces like belief polarization has come to be the center of narrative gravity for our understanding of ourselves, right? That is, we're more likely to change religions than we are to change parties in this country. Once we affiliate with a party, it is one of the most stable kinds of normative commitment we have as a people, right? Once you declare yourself a Democrat, you're a Democrat for life, 9 times out of 10.
Unless you're Joe Manchin.
We'll see about that. Right?
I agree. I just wanted to poke fun at it.
Yeah. And notice, right? I mean, the changing of the party stuff is big news.
Yes.
Right? Because people don't change parties. Now, all of that means is this. What all that means is this. We are a heavily belief polarized population. That means that likely voters for candidate A are also likely to have certain lifestyle habits, likely to buy certain products. They're likely to live in, by the way, Republicans and Democrats live in different kinds of houses. The number of the number of maps you have in your home positively correlates with how likely you are to vote liberal. The number of clocks you have in your home positively correlates with being conservative. So you're like right down to little choices about how we furnish our homes are connected to partisan identity. And what that means is that candidates, right, because here's just a political science-y thing to say, right? You know, winning, especially at the national level in the United States, winning an election has almost nothing to do with changing anybody's mind, right? Winning an election has to do with mobilizing the people who are already on your side to do certain things like vote or give money or phone bank or canvass, right? Or volunteer in some way or other. So what the candidates, especially at the national level, what the national parties, the national party organizations have to do is figure out ways to extract political behavior from their base. They're not interested in growing the base or convincing people of one thing or the other. They're just interested in motivating behavior. If you know, just like if you were selling peanut butter, right? If you know, well, the person who's interested in buying peanut butter is also likely to be interested in these other sorts of things, you've got crucial bits of information about how to advertise your peanut butter. Similarly, in politics, like, oh, the people who are likely to vote for my candidate are also likely to be anxious about X, worried about this other thing, fearful, resentful, indignant about X, Y, and Z. Well, that's how we're gonna run our candidate. And that's all politics at the national level, at least, especially, is in this country. It's just, you know, each of the parties trying to tap into the citizenry's distrust, dislike, disgust with, and fear of the people on the other side.
Right.
This is why every couple of months you get a scare, right? You get a critical race theory scare, or there's a caravan that's going to invade America.
Yes.
You remember this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember this. And so this is a good point that I want to interject on. So, okay. Yeah. And this is where what I said at the beginning, I think, is really important. And that is people, and I'm not accusing people of being stupid. What I'm saying is that people don't have a lot of time. And the only way that I see a lot of people, right, not all, because I don't like to generalize, but a good chunk of people that I talk to that are on one side or the other, because I find it very few and far between people who are in the middle anymore. That is almost completely gone. It's one or the other. And what I hear is these big topics like you're talking about, right? Like these big things that kind of come around. And then, people wonder, well, why is it that people are so, like you brought up about like trusting the science, right? Well, like for one example for me is that like, I was reading this article and I was watching the Black community in New York. They were talking about how, and I believe the number I saw was that the 73% of unvaccinated people in New York is the Black community. And they said it's because they don't trust the government because of things like the Tuskegee experiments, right? They don't want to be tested on. And so because of that fear, they don't want to do that. And so I guess my question is like, should we really shame people like that because of a fear that is a little true, right? I'm not saying it's true today, but historically, they've had some not so great things happen to them. Should we really be shaming them because of that? Or is there a better way to go about it, right? And that's one very unique thing that I'm talking about. But then what I see happening that frustrates me is the belief polarization. I really like that you said that, because that is the more correct thing. It's not really political polarization, it's belief polarization. And I don't know how that can get fixed. And an example of that is I was talking in my last episode, I was talking to a professor in Albany, and what he was saying is that we are living in the neo-modernism, postmodernism society. But what he sees happening is that we're going to go through a new romantic era. We're heading into a new era where this harsh political environment that we're in, it's going to be let go because people are going to get so fed up with it. We're going to move into almost like a new enlightenment phase where people are moving away from these ideas because they're going to be more interested in art. They're going to be more interested in reading and education and things like that. I would love that. Obviously, that would be great, but I don't know that that's real. What are your comments on that?
Well, there's a lot in there. So let me take up a couple of the things and let me know if I skip over anything. So to start with the end, here's a hopeful thought, much in line with the at least some of what's driving your previous guests' thinking. Because belief polarization is so tightly connected with negative feelings, right? Negative emotions, resentment, indignation, distrust, right? One has hope. It seems I have hope. Let me just put it that way. Emotions are finite resources.
Yeah.
There's a certain point at which you just don't have any more anger to give, right? A certain point at which you can't be resentful anymore. Your store of resentment has kind of run out. So, one hopeful thought is that eventually the American citizenry is going to be spent, right? It's the rancor, the incivility, the constant state of alert towards an existential threat that is posed by your fellow citizens. Eventually, that resource is just going to run out, and people aren't going to have the stomach or the heart for it. Now, whether that means that what will replace it is, a new romantic era of, enlightened experimenters with art and all the rest. That's a hopeful thought that I'm not sure what. For my part, I'm not sure what happens after the resentment runs out, but it's got to run out sometime.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
So that's a hopeful thought. Now on to some of the other things. So, I think that part of, and again, let me just remind your audience, because what I'm about to say will not be surprising because I'm a political philosophy professor, right? Yes. I think that part of what accounts for some of the dysfunctions that we've just been talking about is that I think that as a public, as a community of citizens, despite the fact that we seem to talk more and more in very highfalutin terms about the Constitution and rights and separation of powers and legalities and precedent and all, despite the fact that the public conversation has adopted a very sophisticated vocabulary, I think that we've lost sense or lost sight as a country of what democracy is all about. Democracy is a form of Republican government. By that, I don't mean the Republican Party. Right. I mean Republican in the sense that it's democracy is a mode by which people are ruled by laws. And so our democracy, our democratic republic, is a community, is a society that is committed to the ideal of self-government among equals. Mm-hmm. And so you hear a lot about at least one of the entailments of the self-government part, right? So you think that we are a society aspiring to be a self-governing society. That's where you get a lot of these almost libertarian ideas about how the government shouldn't be in control of me. The government should not be in control of the things that I have to, navigate in my life, right? We get a lot of talk about, worries about government takeover, government mandates. And by the way, part of me wants to say, some suspicion about government overreach, government getting too involved in your life, government taking itself to be entitled
Tyranny.
to force you to do things, all of that needs to be met with suspicion. Of
Yes.
course it does. No one's denying that, right? Well, at least I'm not denying that.
Right. Yeah.
But we can't lose sight of the fact that the commitment of a democratic republic is not the commitment simply to each person's individual liberty. It is a commitment to individual liberty. It's not simply or only a commitment to individual liberty. It's a commitment to everybody's liberty as an equal. And so when you start saying, well, wait a minute now, anytime the government does anything, it's forcing people to do things. That's what government is. In fact, that's just politics. Politics is the exercise of power. That's all. That's what politics is. So we can't object, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't object simply to the exercise of power. The objections, where they are worthy objections, have to be to the unjustified exertion of power.
Right.
What justifies government power? Equality, right? Government has to maintain the conditions under which we can live, not merely as free, but that we can live together as free, which means live together as equals. And so a lot of the libertarian arguments about mandates and masking and all the rest, I think totally miss this point. By the way, there could be other kinds of arguments about the effectiveness of masks and all the rest. I think I know what I think about those things, but whatever. But just the idea that, well, it's not government, the government can't tell me I have to wear a mask. Of course they can. The government can tell you got to wear a seatbelt. The government can tell you that there are all kinds of, government can tell you have to wash your hands if you are a restaurant employee and you're leaving a bathroom, no matter what you did in the bathroom, right? Government can
that's a
tell
great
you all
point.
kinds of stuff, right? Why? Because the government's job is not merely to protect us, it is, right? Not merely to protect our stuff, it is, right?
Yeah.
It's also to perform those crucial actions of protecting our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness while recognizing our fundamental equality. And when you're talking about highly transmissible, right, illness, when you're talking about actions that, unless they're performed in particular ways, negatively impact others, well, the government can step in it and tell you how to perform those kinds of actions, because if it doesn't, that gives you a real easy way to control other people's lives.
Yeah. You brought up a really great point there. And I wish that more people were as articulate as you to explain that, because what I see happen with people in the real world outside of academics is that there is a limit to conversation, where as soon as you're unable to continue making your point or give examples or facts, it gets reduced to name calling and aggression, because you've reached the exhaustion of conversation, and I see that happening all the time. But in this conversation is well said, because you obviously have the knowledge, you have the experience, you have read enough material, you have studied enough that you know this well, and I have never had somebody explain all of that the way that you just did, and I think myself and my audience will be better for it. Now, the question I want to add on to this, right, because you brought up a good point, which is the government can tell you to wash your hands if you work in a restaurant, right? And I think that simple things like that, nobody questions, right? Nobody really thinks much about that. But it's only until this thing, right, this idea of mask mandates and, vaccine mandates, that has touched a nerve that has made people react. And that is why we are seeing this happen. And so then the question is, should it be in question, or at what point do we recognize Like maybe the government shouldn't have that much influence over our lives, right? Is it a matter of they should or they shouldn't? Because I think that that's really the baseline of the conversation of these two sides. Should they or shouldn't they, right? And as you said, well, they do, because that is the way that our government operates. And I think that where we are is now people are questioning, well, should they have that authority? And it makes me think of, I just got done reading Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and him talking about, not complying with the government, not even wanting to pay taxes, going to jail because he didn't want to pay taxes. And it makes me think of that right now. And you talked in the very early about tyranny, and something I get concerned about is at what point, because governments do not, at least in my very limited life experience, it seems that governments, once they get certain powers, they're not really likely to give them back. They're not really, it takes a lot to reverse something once it's been put in place, right? And so I think that that is another thing, playing devil's advocate. It's like people say, we can say, yes, the government has this authority to do this right now. The devil's advocate part is, should they be allowed to do that? And at what point, if we allow them to keep making decisions for us, at what point does it come tyranny?
Good. So two points. One is a sort of political philosophy point I want to mention and then come back to, and then the second is an example. One of the sort of philosophical thoughts that I don't think is, the thing that one can master only after, earning a PhD in political philosophy. This was I think a pretty, this is a pretty simple idea. It's right there in the Declaration. Our founding documents sort of affirm the following thought. Our democratic republic is an attempt to answer a very deep philosophical problem, which is, how can there be a relatively just and decent political order among equals? Because politics is always about exercising power, right? Exercising power is always about some people exercising power over others. So it looks like politics is fundamentally at odds with the idea of equality. Because it looks like if we're equals, nobody's my boss, nobody gets to impose on me. It's like, well, a democratic republic is supposed to be a model of politics that reconciles exercises of coercive force, that's what law is, right?
Yeah.
With people standing as equal citizens. And something about democracy and democratic voice, the ability to play an equal role in authoring the government, in authorizing the law, in creating the people who are going to creating the offices and filling the offices by which laws are made, is supposed to reconcile those two things. And we could talk more about that if you want, but let me just give you a very quick example with respect to the sliding into tyranny concern, because I think that, yeah, that's a really relevant concern, right? Have you ever met anybody who's had tuberculosis?
No.
Good, I have. You know what happened to them?
Tell me.
For 6 months, somebody from the government showed up in their apartment to observe them take medicines, some of which were known to pose certain kinds of health risks. And if the person decided to not let this government official into her apartment that morning, she would be arrested on the spot. So this friend of mine endured 6 months of being visited by various people in the morning to simply watch her take her pills. Now, you know why you don't know anybody who has tuberculosis?
Because
she did that.
Yeah.
She did that. That's what she did. Right?
Yes.
People have been being treated for tuberculosis. It's a pretty rare thing, but people have been being treated for tuberculosis in this way for a long, long time. And you're just hearing about it now. Guess what? The government didn't take over your life. In fact, the government made it possible for you to live a good number of years, I don't know how old you are, Cameron, without ever thinking about tuberculosis.
Mm.
Why? Because there are people right now, it's a small number of them, but because it's a small number of them because they comply with a law that says, if you are in this medical condition, here's what the next 6 years of your life are going to be like. And if you don't like it, you will be arrested and put into a facility where you will be imprisoned and forced to take the therapy.
Mm.
Now, that strikes me as like, oh, how many people have tuberculosis right now that we'll never know about? They're going to eventually, right, finish the round of therapies and then get back to their lives. And you might never know that they ever had tuberculosis, but it's because they endured a pretty, again, a demand. By the way, when I say that this person every morning was visited to watch so that somebody can watch her take 6 pills, these were not easy pills to take. They were risky, right? They are associated with various kinds of kidney issues, right? So taking taking one of the pills that was for the tuberculosis therapy heightened her risk for various kinds of kidney dysfunction. One of the pills, when it reached a certain level of activeness in her body, turned her perspiration orange. That's a side effect, right?
Yeah.
So she endured a whole lot for
Yeah.
a big chunk of her life in a way, right, that was forced. But because of that, you'll never have to meet her. You'll never have to know any, you could go your whole life and never meet anybody who's had tuberculosis. Why? Because the people who get it are treated to a particular kind of very demanding, coercive force by the government. So the government has been doing this, and because it's successful at it, is exactly why it's not a force of this particular action of the government. It's not tyrannizing the country. It's liberating you, right?
Yeah.
It's making it the case that you don't have, when was before this conversation, had you ever thought about, when was the last time you even thought the word tuberculosis?
Never.
Right? You never thought about it, right? But now you're like, oh, there's a reason why you never thought about it, because you don't have to. The reason why you don't have to think about it is because the government has instantiated a pretty very highly successful, right, regimen for dealing with the public health threat that tuberculosis poses. The way it deals with it is it subjects those who contract it to some pretty harsh demands on the basis simply of, right, the protecting the rest of the society from a force, right, from an illness that will destroy their lives.
Yeah.
So
No,
I tend to think of the COVID stuff in those terms, right? These are, sometimes let me put it, last point here.
Go ahead.
Sometimes when government succeeds, there's a sort of tragic element of government success. When government is doing something well, part of the success consists in the fact that it becomes invisible to us, right?
Yes.
And so we see government dysfunction. Every pothole looks to us like, oh, the government can't be trusted to do anything, right? Every time that we see something going wrong, we think, the government, every time it tries to do something, right? Look what you get, right? And by the way, I'm not, my own philosophical proclivities are pretty close to anarchism, right? So I'm not an apologist for the government or for states.
Right.
I'm just saying, as a conceptual point, the failures stick out, and we never take a moment to think of all the things that we never have to think about, well, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Because government has succeeded at something. Tuberculosis is a really, you should go look go. Your audience should go Google what happens if you contract tuberculosis and you're going to read horrific stuff. And then you'll also find out that it's extremely unlikely that you'll ever have to deal with any of it. Why? Because government succeeds at handling it when it happens.
So what I wanted to say again is that that was really well articulated. And I think like this is what frustrates me, is that I feel like a lot of people in government are not as good at saying things like that as you are just now. Twice now, I've had my mind changed by something that you've said, because you had, one, articulated it well, and you had a good source of information to pull from to give me a good example of that. You're absolutely right. Never thought of that, never even heard of that. But you are right. You are right. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I just wish that let me back this up by saying, I think that the reason that this has become such a trigger point is because people don't have the ability to speak about this. People are not having conversations anymore. They're having arguments, not conversations. And what we are doing is conversing. And you just gave me a really good story, a really good source to pull from to create an example of how this works and why people should buy into it. And that just right there, I'm not going to lie to you, you changed my mind about something right there. And I think that if people could just calm down a little bit and talk to each other, that we might be able to make more, we might be able to make more progress if people could just articulate things better and listen to people who have information and stories to back it up.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll just say this very broadly. I think that the incentives in politics, we're talking over a podcast, it's about politics. We're not doing politics right now. We're talking about political ideas. But, part of the Overdoing Democracy book makes this point that more and more of our lives appear to us as political sites of activity. More and more of what we do in the country feels to us like exercises of citizenship, right? Wearing the yoga pants or the camo or the red cap or driving the hybrid feels to us like we're exercising civic virtue by shopping at one place rather than the other, not buying Kellogg's products or eating at Chick-fil-A is a way of communicating and expressing our partisan ideals. It turns out that that's just really bad for democracy. That's where you get the title Overdoing Democracy. It's like when everything becomes an exercise of citizenship, when everything we do becomes a mode of expressing our partisan allegiances, we become really bad we become really bad at democratic citizenship. Why? Because, as we were saying a moment ago, politics is not about being informed. It's not about being reflected. I mean, the way that we practice politics,
right?
It's not about being informed. It's not about being reflective. It's not about conceding a good point when somebody has made one. It's about trying to marshal your troops to get out and vote or give money or volunteer. And, again, I'm assuming you will remember, in John McCain's presidential campaign, when he responded to that woman in the town hall who said that Obama was a terrorist and a Muslim and a bad man, and McCain said, no, he's a good man.
Fascinating. I think I may have been too young for that one.
Well, you should go look at it. He probably lost a lot of voters.
Yeah.
With that statement.
Definitely.
Right. There's a woman, a woman stands up. She's very, people tell me that he's a Muslim, that he's a terrorist. And she starts going off on a particular thread. He takes the microphone back and says, no, ma'am, no, he's a good man. We just disagree about politics.
Yeah.
And of course, when I saw that, I was like, good for John McCain. But, my friends who are Republican strategists said, Yeah, well, he probably just lost the election.
Mm.
And by the way, he lost a lot of voters. I don't know if it would have
Certainly.
been turn the, but yeah, he probably lost. He definitely lost a lot of voters, because politics, when everything becomes so saturated with partisan allegiance and when everything's so wrapped up in our political aims, it's like we squeeze out of our lives moments for reflection, right? I'll give you one other example of this. In the lead up to the 2016 election, maybe, living, I don't know if you're originally from Tennessee, but
no, I'm from Oregon originally.
Oh, okay. Well, so maybe you experienced something similar. When I first moved to Nashville back in 2001, there are lots of things that were different between Nashville and New York City, but one of the things that was sort of interesting was, how chatty people are in Nashville, maybe throughout the South, certainly in other parts of Tennessee, I've noticed this. So you'll be standing online, you'll be pumping gas or whatever, and somebody will just, start chit-chatting with you. This is the kind of thing that just doesn't happen where I come from, right?
Yeah.
Where I'm originally from. People don't initiate social interactions with strangers. But anyway, and so, in the 2016 election, it was not uncommon when you're standing online for groceries or filling your tank with gas, for some stranger, at least to me, maybe I just have an approachable demeanor, I don't know, some stranger just come up to say, did you hear what Trump did?
Mm.
And because this was a campaign season where at every turn, each of the candidates was doing something, saying something, where, the next day it was just like, did you hear Hillary last night? Did you see the Access Hollywood tape? Did you look at the tweet? Did you watch the thing? Right. And, I'm a political philosopher and a democratic theorist. And at a certain point, I was just like, I just want to buy groceries. I just want to fill the tank with gas. I just want to, walk in the park. I don't want to, it's nice to have an active, engaged citizenry that's ready to talk about stuff. Good. But, I've got, I'm at capacity for this. What I started doing very foolishly, thinking that this would signal to others that, I just don't want to have the conversation. People would say, did you see Hillary's tweet? Or did you hear Hillary last night? I just started saying, yeah, but I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Like, did you see the video? Yeah, I saw the video. I'm still thinking about it. Now, let me just ask, like, this was, but I'm sure you're wiser than I was in 2016. Like, this is not a good way to, this was almost always taken as an invitation for more discussion. Okay. So, I messed it up in that regard, but, let me just ask you to guess. Do you know, like, every time I would say, I'm still not sure what to think of that yet, almost to a person, in every instance, the person thought that when I said, I saw it, but I'm not sure what to think about it, person instantly recounted the thing that he was referencing.
Yeah.
As if I didn't know what had happened.
Well,
he's on a bus and he's with Billy Bush and he's talking about a woman who's there to interview them. And he says X, Y, and Z, and he mentions this, that, and the other thing. And he brags about sexual assault. And that's what happened. I said, yeah, I know that I saw the tape. I told you I saw it. Still thinking about what to make of it. This was, in lots of instances, when I, for example, said that about the Access Hollywood tape and Donald Trump, almost across the board taken as an expression of support for Donald Trump.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you mean? You need to think about what that means?
Yeah, exactly.
It's obvious what it means. If you need to think about what it means, then you're getting ready to excuse what is on that tape, right? Or the deplorables, comment, Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. Well, she called all Republican voters a basket of deplorables. Said, yeah, I told you. I saw the speech. I heard her say that. I'm just not sure what to make of it yet. Well, what to make of it is that she's elitist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what to make of that.
Yeah.
The idea, here's the broader point. The idea that politics calls for moments, occasions, for just putting on the brakes and thinking about what was said, what was communicated, what happened, what the candidate meant, that was itself seen as a politically suspicious thing. Oh, I was told in the Hillary case.
Yeah.
Well, you must be an elitist too if you don't know what to make of that.
Exactly.
If you think there's another side that's worth thinking about, you're probably on the other side, right? Like, well, wait a minute. Like, when did politics become
us versus them?
And us versus them in the most knee-jerk, right, slap-happy way, where us versus them, you don't need to think about what's going on. There's no time for reflection. Reflection itself is politically suspect. It's a way of being disloyal to your partisan tribe when you say, I heard what she was saying. I'm still thinking about what to make of it.
Right.
When did democracy become so, right? And by the way,
Yes.
this is, we've got this is one of the ways in which social media hooks us, and the way in which politics works on social media. It's like,
yes,
how quick, it's not whether you like the thing or you upgrade or you give it like, how quick did you like it? Did you retweet this? Well, why aren't you retweeting this? Why aren't you liking this? Why didn't you friend me back? How this idea that everything is supposed to be instantaneous, that if you're doing your job as a citizen, you know where you stand, and knowing where you stand always means that you always know what to think. That is a profoundly anti-democratic norm that has taken hold of our political culture. The suspicion of reflection.
Thought crimes.
Yeah, good, right? The idea that you don't need to think. If you need to think, then you must not be on our side. If you're on our side, knowing what the video showed, right? Knowing what was on the video is to know what to think about the video. Knowing what the comment was, knowing what she said is to know what to think about what she said. That seems to me to be fundamentally, deeply democratically dysfunctional, problematic from the point of view of democracy. That reflection is a betrayal of citizenship. That's the way we treat it. And, unless we get a hold of that and retrieve it, I think we're in very, very bad political shape for the next several decades.
I agree. And what it makes me think of is, I forget where I heard this, but it was a conversation about how we have moved away from, people are moving away from religious dogma in droves. They don't like it anymore, but what they're replacing it with is political ideologies. So in the same way that people might be diehard Christians, they're becoming diehard Democrats, right? Or diehard Republicans. And what happens is now we're in these extremes, which means that people are buying into these, almost religious-like extremes of these political spheres. And what happens with that is that the political figures, the head figures, people like Trump, people like Hillary Clinton, all of them, right? What happens is that we idolize these people or we demonize them. And then what happens is that, Trump says something or Hillary says something, and then this is where the conversation you just had comes into play. And what frustrates me, and what I don't understand why people don't see this, is that these are still people. These are not gods, which means that they lie, which means that they say things that they may not mean, or they get caught in a candid moment, right? It's like the thing that really irritated me was that people were so critical of Trump, of the things he said in the past. But I'm like, okay, but let's be real for a minute. Okay, let's just be real for a minute. I don't think Trump ever thought he was going to be president, so he didn't care about what he said. Do we really think that people like George Bush and his father, we don't think that they maybe said some shisty things in their heyday? They just were better about hiding it than other people, right? Do we really think that every president before Trump has just been perfect and never said anything that would be considered messed up or not politically correct, right? I just don't think that it's I just don't think that it's a good thought to um idolize these people, right? And hold them to such a high standard as we did the Greek gods, like these Zeus figures, and say like, oh no, Obama was perfect, right? Well, it's like, well, maybe not perfect, but a good president, sure. You don't think that Obama said some messed up things behind closed doors when nobody was listening? Everybody does, because he's human, not a god, right? Yeah, of course Trump said some horrible things. I guarantee 20 years ago he did not think he was going to be president, and even if he did, he doesn't care. That is who his character is, right? His character is, I'm going to say what I want to say and I don't care.
Right.
Most other people in politics are careful of what they say because they know they're in the field of politics. They know that this is where their career is heading. So they're more careful. They pick and choose what they're going to say. But even when they do that, right? Even when they do that, they still get on, C-SPAN, or they're in these debates for the presidential race, and they say something, and even with their best intentions, even being careful, they say something that still manages to piss somebody off.
Yeah. And so I think that this is the flip side, as it were, of the move in democratic politics to make everything about the personalities and the affective ties to the persons, and less about policy. So because, again, this is also just part of what belief polarization encourages, right? By the way, the criticisms of, the personalities, right? Hillary or Trump, just to give, two very present kinds of examples. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that these are not meant to change anybody's mind, right?
Right.
These are ways of cheerleading, right? For or against the person you've already decided, you're against. So like, right, the calling out, the gaffe, right? The misstep, is not a way really of criticizing Hillary or Trump or Joe Biden or anybody, right? It's a way of sort of, nudging and elbowing with a smile on your face the people who already hate them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
The echo
So,
chamber.
yeah, so that's the, and again, it has nothing to do, right? Nothing to do ultimately with, making an argument for a policy. Nothing to do with that. In fact, it has so little to do with that, it was noticed, but not seen as incredibly newsworthy or remarkable, that, the Republican National Convention had no platform. They did not craft a party platform. The platform was re-electing Trump.
Yeah.
It's the guy, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's the guy, right? And, last week, Mitch McConnell said there's not going to be a national GOP party platform for the midterms. Like, well, so now it's really not about policy anymore. It's about let's go Brandon. It's about it's about the symbolic dislike, the hatred of the squad, the memes. It's about the symbolic, because that turns out to be the more reliable way to extract political behavior from the base. And again, that's what the name of the game has become. It's not about, by the way, let me just give another example. Signature policy for the Trump presidency was a wall along the southern border of the country. some of which was built, some parts of an existing wall were repaired, but the campaign agenda item was unfulfilled, which was this big beautiful wall. Do you remember any discussion from the White House about acquiring the land, 80% of which is privately owned?
No.
Now, think for a second.
Okay.
So one of the by the way, I would say respectable, philosophically very formidable feature of traditional Republican U.S. Republican Party political commitments is the centrality of property rights.
Yes, definitely.
Good, right? This is, good Lockean, right? Property rights are central. If I don't have rights to my stuff, all the other rights are somehow now thrown into, if the government can come and take my stuff, right? Then what other rights can I possibly have if I don't have rights to the things I own, right?
Yes.
By the way, formidable view, right? Perfectly, reasonable, piece of political philosophy, it seems to me. So you've got a major party candidate win election, win the presidency on the basis of one signature policy item, which was building a wall along the southern border, which would have required, had they been able to do it, the acquisition of miles and miles and miles of land that's privately owned.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I've looked because I've, again, like, as a political theorist, I'm like, well, wait a minute, like, I feel, some sympathies towards that Lockean thought that it's, property rights are really fundamental. I feel that, right?
Definitely.
Well, how are they going to get the land? Forget about whether this is a good idea or not, or whether this is a way to address immigration, whether the problem of immigration is the problem. Forget about all that, right? Just, okay, they want to build a wall. Maybe there's good reason to build a wall. We're leaving that aside. How are they going to buy the land?
Yeah.
What are they going to do with somebody who says, it's not for sale? By the way, it turns out that there's lots of that land. It's not only privately owned, but the person who owns the land owns a plot of land that is on both sides of the border. Right? So the land itself, the thing that I own doesn't respect the border between the United States and Mexico. So I own land in Mexico that is contiguous with, right, the land I own in the US. So he's like, well, wait a minute, this is a real, there's a policy issue here about acquiring land. And it's not just the question of how they're going to get the money to buy the land, how they're going to set the price, all that. It's like, well, how are you going to acquire it? You're going to force, is it eminent domain? I mean, is it like, how do you acquire it? Is it people, you just go take the land and give them money and say, it doesn't matter if it's for sale or not, right? And so it's like, well, that's a puzzling feature. That's a puzzling piece of this policy initiative, is that there's going to have to be this massive acquiring of privately owned land. And for a political coalition that has as one of its central lodestars a kind of Lockean view about property. It's like, it's remarkable that that's not part of the policy discussion.
Yeah, that's actually, again, like, I didn't know that. That's really fascinating. And I think a lot of people, if they knew that, would also be kind of like stumped. That's a really good point. Again, it's just, those are more examples.
And now you're right. You want to just say, well, wait a minute, right? The building the wall thing was just I don't know if it was just, but let me just put it this way. Build a wall was a really good campaign rallying cry.
Yeah, definitely.
It was really good symbolism. It was really good marketing. It was really good. It was a good way to encapsulate, right, into one simple phrase, build the wall, right? A lot of the affective, a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the emotional states that people who are disposed to vote Republican feel, right?
Yeah.
And so the policy stuff kind of just never really managed to get hashed out because, here's the cynical way of reading it. Again, it was never going to happen. So they
Yeah.
never had to start making phone calls to ranchers in Texas who, use that land and say, well, we're going to take it now.
Yeah. Wow. God, that's crazy.
Right?
Okay. All right. Now to close this thing up, I want to ask you one more thing. And this may not be an easy question to answer, but I just want to leave the floor open to you to close this up. Where do you see, okay, after doing all of this, saying what we've said and analyzing what we've analyzed, where do you see politics heading in the foreseeable future? At least, there's always long term and short term. So let's just speak in the short term. In the next couple of years, where do you see politics heading? Right? We already addressed that people are going to eventually had enough of resentment, and they're going to give it up. But do you see that happening sooner or later? Where do you think politics is heading?
I think that the next several election cycles are going to be, if not more of the same that we've grown familiar with, are going to intensify and, are going to be worse. I'm not
Yeah.
I've said in other interviews, and I don't do optimism. It's philosophically not where I'm at. I don't know if that's a pessimistic, or I don't know exactly how pessimistic it is. I think that the institutions, our democratic, institutions are pretty resilient. So I think that the country will persist. I think that the democratic institutions will persist. What I think we'll start seeing, though, is more intense dislike, distrust, inability to get along with people whose politics we don't share. I think we'll see escalating rhetoric about the fundamental unsuitedness for democracy of anybody who's not just like us and our friends, which, by the way, it's a fundamentally anti-democratic thought that, democracy is only for people who are like me. It's fundamentally, that's the authoritarian thought. That's not the democratic thought.
You're absolutely right.
And so, I think that we're going to see a lot of the hostility and animosity and the temperature get turned up, even as the politicians in certain moments, tell us how terrible it is that the temperature is so high and how terrible it is that, the rhetoric has gotten so uncivil.
But it works in the best favor for them.
Yeah, because, nobody likes the incivility. Right. By the way, here's just a fact about the country. We are, as a citizenry, all agreed that, especially at the national level, high stakes politics is become too toxic. That is like it's upwards of 65% in a Pew Research study of citizens in the country agree strongly with the statement that politics at the national level has become too toxic, too acrimonious, too uncivil. We need more civility, is what we all seem to agree on. The problem is that when you ask those same citizens, well, what makes politics so toxic and uncivil? They say, it's the other guys. Yeah. They're the ones doing it.
Yeah.
And so calling for more civility, Joe Biden's inauguration speech, we need to unify. We can't see each other as enemies. It's like, oh, sounds great. But it's like, yeah, it sounds great if you're somebody who likes Joe Biden. If you're somebody if somebody's like, well, wait a minute, you're not the guy, you weren't my first choice for president.
Yeah.
Maybe you weren't my third choice for president. You weren't my first choice for president. When you say unify, it sounds to me like you're saying that everyone's got to be on your side.
Yes.
That everyone's got to capitulate to you. well, I'm not going to be civil to somebody who expects me, right, to
Yeah.
just get in line, get in lockstep behind them, right? So, even the rhetoric, even the language of civility has become itself an instrument for deepening our belief polarization. So, yeah, I think the short run is going to be very frustrating,
Yeah.
and I think that the possibilities for political violence will also escalate.
Yeah, I think you're right. Robert, man, this has been such a good conversation. Honestly, even if it's not for my viewers, I'm sure it will be, but for me personally, this has been a very enlightening conversation, and you've opened my mind to several different things that have made me really stump and go, okay. But if people want to know more about you, if they want to read your books or maybe read some of your published work, where can they find that? What are the names of your books?
So the two books are there's the one, and then I'm going to show everybody the new one, which is called
Yes,
Sustaining Democracy: What We Owe to the Other Side,
that's next on my list.
which is a book about we are more and more inclined as citizens to have the following thought. I'm sure listeners will have had this thought. Why do I have to bother listening to, showing any respect or regard for people who are on the politically other side of the aisle? They're depraved. They're terrible. They're wrong. They're on the side of injustice. They want to destroy the Constitution. Why do I have to treat them as my fellow citizens when they're so, they're so contemptible? That's a book that says, well, you need to keep your enemies around if you want to have friends.
Yes.
Is the way the argument works. But anyway, the two books, Overdoing Democracy and Sustaining Democracy, are really kind of where I'm at now as far as a political philosophy goes. Those are both books that were written with the idea that they might attract readership beyond other professors. A lot of my other work, I'm afraid to sad to say, a lot of my other work is just academic work based on research written for other people who are engaged in research. So I don't know that I would recommend
Certainly.
a lot of my other books, except let me just say this. Anybody who's interested in just understanding what political philosophy is, I have a book that's an introduction to political philosophy called Engaging Political Philosophy. That is a really short book that's just about what political philosophers do, what questions political philosophers are interested in asking, and what are some of the answers to those questions. So anyway, that's what I do. But people can visit my webpage, my faculty webpage at Vanderbilt's philosophy department, and there are links to all kinds of things. And I have a Twitter account where I often, which is just ampersand Robert Talisse, where I often just tell people, what I'm up to if people want to find out.
Okay, excellent. Well, seriously, thank you again for being here. I'd love to have you on again. I think
Sure.
that, especially as you said, the political field is only going to probably get more heated. So this is probably a good space for people who want to find some sanity when in regards to politics. But for everybody else, we'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening. This has been Hermit Radio.
Thank you.